Welcome back to the History of the American Mafia, a series for podcasts written and adapted by Fabio Fabiano and translated and read by me, Grace Carlisi. This is the continuation of the story of the murder of the barrel. Today we're going to talk about the first investigations. I hope you enjoyed the episode. The case of the murder of the barrel was passed on to Detective Sergeant Arthur Carey. He was the first investigator with previous experience in murder cases to conduct the investigation. The investigator slowly searched the victim's pockets and took his personal effects off him. Then he drew up a list: a coin, a pocket calendar, crucifix, a few handkerchiefs, one of which was perfumed, a chain dangling from his waistcoat, but no pocket watch, and no wallet. Based on these personal effects, it was impossible to identify the victim of the barrel murder case. The sergeant advanced a hypothesis. He was an Italian, and the murder was probably linked to one of the many feuds that took place in Little Italy. It was clear that to resolve that particular case, it would be necessary to ask for the intervention of the only policeman in the New York Police Department that could have successfully investigated. So Carey didn't hesitate and summoned Sergeant Joe Petrosino to the spot. The Italian-American policeman arrived about an hour after the body had been found. With the help of Petrosino, the investigations got on the right foot. Meanwhile, the newly arrived policeman confirmed his belief that the body was that of an Italian. Once the inspection of the victim's body and his personal effects was completed, the two investigators dedicated themselves to analysing the barrel. The wooden container was very cheap, and the metal rims were missing. Once the body was extracted, it was easy to examine the contents on the bottom of the barrel. Plastered among the shavings of sawdust and blood, they found onion peels, a hairpin and some black cigar butts of Italian manufacture. Petrosino identified the remains as material commonly found on the floor of a restaurant. The analysis of the barrel continued. He passed his fingertips between the interstices of the staves and collected some white granules. He tasted the corrected material in order to determine what it was, and without doubt he declared sugar. Therefore, that barrel had been used to transport the sweet substance. Another decisive element that led to the understanding of the original use of the barrel was an inscription engraved at the base, W and T, and the following serial number, G 223, printed along the side of the stave. At that point, the two investigators went to the other side of the river, where there were the most important sugar refineries in the area. At the Wallace and Thompson firm at Washington Street sugarcane refinery, they discovered that G223 was the initials of one of the barrels sold to an Italian. The owner of the firm was very specific. The barrel had been sold to Pietro Inzerillo, who owned a pastry shop on Elizabeth Street. The cafe was adjacent to the Prince Street spaghetti shop, popular amongst Italian immigrants. An autopsy of the corpse was performed in the morning. The coroner established that the murder had taken place between 3:30 and 4 in the morning, that the contents of the victim's stomach was typical Italian food, and that he had counted 17 post-fatal stab wounds. Although the body had been shown to thousands of policemen, a photo had been published in the most important New York newspapers, they still hadn't been able to trace the victim's identity. Then again, one of our favourite characters in this story, one we have come to know by now and appreciate, read the newspaper and spotted an important clue for the identification of the corpse found inside the barrel. We are talking about the head of the New York Secret Services, or the stubborn but brilliant investigator, William Flynn. The more the agent looked at the photograph of the victim printed in the newspaper, the more he was convinced that it was the same man he had seen by a sleazy butcher's shop on Stanton Street at number 16. Secret services were on the trail of a gang peddling fake $5 banknotes. After weeks of stalking, they were led to this same butcher's shop. The business had recently changed owner, and the previous one had been replaced by a certain Vito La Duca, who had already been arrested for forgery and spending of fake money in Pennsylvania. Connected to La Duca, there was another man with a clean record who ran a pastry cafe in Prince Street. It was Piero Inzerillo, and other known offenders. In truth, as we have already said, this was the gang headed by Giuseppe Morello, the head of the first mafia family in New York. On April the 13th, or that is, one day before the body had been found in the barrel, Flynn had decided to go and take a look at the target that his men were following and watching. His goal was to identify 7 or 8 other characters who gravitated around the butcher's shop and who were most likely involved in the illegal counterfeiting of spending of fake dollars. It was 8 in the evening, and despite the cold and wind, the street was crowded. Along with his men stationed 100 meters away, Flynn observed the movements inside the butcher's shop. It was evident that the men were arguing inside, and as a precaution the owner had covered the entrance with a drape so that what was happening inside the shop was not visible from the outside. The chief of agents was informed that a man had come out of the store and was leaning against a lamp, smoking. Well, that unknown man was the same one photographed in the newspapers and indicated as the victim of the case of the dead man in the barrel, which, as the newspaper headlined, was one of the bloodiest murders that had ever occurred in New York in the recent years. Flynn didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and ordered his men, who were with him on April the 13th, to go to the morgue to check if they recognized the body as the unknown man who had come out of La Duca's butcher's shop to smoke a cigarette under the street light. At the morgue, his men closely inspected the corpse and claimed that it was the stranger positioned near the sleazy butcher's shop at number 16 Stanton Street. At that point, dispelling all doubts, the head of the New York Secret Services picked up the phone and called Inspector McCluskey, the head of the investigative section of New York Police Department. Meanwhile, the medical examiner, following the autopsy, had advanced a theory. Since the corpse had no other wounds other than the cut along its throat, it was very likely that the victim had been immobilized with his hands and feet tied up, that is, before receiving the fatal stabs. The scene now moves to Elizabeth Street, where Petrosino and his colleague Carey had identified the Inzerillo pastry shop. Once inside the shop's cellar, it was easy for the 2 policemen to spot a barrel similar to the one used to put the dead body in. This barrel also came from the Wallace and Thompson Company, and according to Inzerillo, in fact, a few days earlier he had emptied the contents, which in fact was sugar, out of a similar barrel and had left it outside the restaurant. Later, he had seen 4 men loading it onto a wagon and taking it away. The pastry chef reported that he used to donate the empty barrels to his feral countrymen. Unfortunately, he declared that this time he did not know the identity, or neither could he describe those who had taken the last barrel. Petrosino took note of Inzerillo's statements, although he didn't believe a single word. Thanks to the investigations carried out up to that point, it was clear that the man found brutally killed inside the barrel had arrived in New York a few days earlier, and that he was associated with a circle of criminals who were involved in counterfeiting banknotes. In particular, the foreigner was seen in the company of members of Giuseppe Morello's gang. Another important element was that Secret Service men had seen the victim of the murder of the barrel together with Joseph Fernando, a giant with a red beard more than 6 feet tall, who had certainly received the task of guarding the stranger so that he did not slip away. At that point, Flynn arranged a meeting with New York Police Department Chief McCluskey, During the meeting, the head of the Secret Services informed the policeman of the illicit activities of Giuseppe Morello and his gang. To those who have not yet listened to the episode on Giuseppe Morello, I would like to explain that he was a ruthless and very smart leader, as also were members of the gang. McCluskey was under pressure from his superiors and the press, so he needed to make arrests in order to calm the public opinion. Despite Flynn's disagreement, McCluskey decided to arrest all members of the Morello gang, and he was convinced that at least one of them, under interrogation, would give in, confessing the facts and accusing the rest of the gang. Flynn was baffled by the decision made by the head of the police investigation section, knowing that his investigation would then be immediately compromised. He was convinced that the arrests were too hasty. After all, there was not the slightest hint of the Morello gang being involved in the murder of the Barrel. It was easy to predict that after the arrests, the suspects would be all released for lack of evidence. Despite his legitimate grievances and warnings, McCluskey didn't change his mind. However, he did accept to allow the Secret Service to search Morello's home during the arrest.